Alright, the ad break is over. That means it is time to start the stream. Hey everyone, PikeSnail68 here, and welcome to today's stream. Cat fact of the day is, a cat almost never meows at another cat, mostly just humans. Cats typically will spit, purr, and hiss at other cats. Wait. Oh, okay. I got confused with that for a second. I'm like, you said they don't meow at other cats, but then you're saying they purr. I confused purr and meow for being the same thing. Spoiler, they are not the same thing. Anyways, yeah, today, it is Book Club Sunday, so that means we're going to be doing more reading. I think it's been a few weeks since I did Book Club Sunday. I've just usually been busy on Sundays, so I haven't been getting around to it, but I finally have time today. So yeah, today we are continuing Mass Effect Revelations, or Revelation, singular. Revelations is an Assassin's Creed game. Yeah, we left off with, we did the prologue and we did chapter 1, so we haven't made too much progress in this book, but actually I did just look at the page count. We're about a 10th of the way through, because we're on like page 32 and there's like 300 something pages. So, you know, we made a bit of progress. Anyways, let's just go ahead and let me adjust my chair a bit because it's sinking. I love it when the chair sinks. Yeah, let us go ahead and get started with it then. Chapter 2. Gunnery Chief Da and Lee, the two Marines on point, scuttled down the gangway. Weapons drawn, they scanned the area for a possible ambush while Anderson, O'Reilly, and Shea covered them from the hold above. Landing zone secured, Da reported across the radio frequency. Once the entire team was on the ground, Anderson took stock of the situation. The landing port was small, room for 3 frigates or maybe a pair of cargo ships. It was located a few hundred meters from a pair of heavy blast doors that led into the structure of the base itself. A rectangular single-story building that barely looked large enough to house the 33 people assigned to the project, let alone any kind of labs for research. The exterior looked eerily normal, while there was no hint that anything was out of the ordinary other than a half-dozen large crates near one of the other large landing pads. That's how the attack began, Anderson thought to himself. Equipment and supplies coming in would have been ferried by hand from arriving ships on cargo sleds up to the doors. Sidon must have... Not Sidon. Sidon? I don't know. Sidon must have been expecting a shipment. When the raiders touched down, they would have begun unloading the crates. Someone inside would have opened the blast doors and 2 or 3 of Sidon's security detail would have come out to help with the cargo, and been gunned down by enemy troops hiding inside the holds of the ships. Strange there are no bodies out here, Don noted, echoing Anderson's own thoughts. Must have dragged them away after they secured the landing port, Anderson said, not certain why anyone would want to do that. Using hand signals, he motioned his team across the deserted landing pad and up to the entrance of the base. The sliding blast doors were featureless and smooth. They were controlled by a simple security panel on the wall. But the fact that the doors were closed didn't sit well with the lieutenant. Anderson was at the head of the team. They all stopped short when he crouched down and held up a raised fist. He held up 2 fingers, signaling for O'Reilly. Hunched over, the corporal moved to the head of the line and fell in beside his leader, resting on one knee. Any reason those doors should be closed? The lieutenant asked him in a sharp whisper. Seems a little weird, he admitted. If someone wanted to wipe out the base, why bother sealing the doors when you leave? Check it out, Anderson told his tech expert. Take it slow and careful. O'Reilly hit a button on his assault rifle, causing the handle, stock, and barrel to fold in on themselves until the gun was a compact rectangle, half its normal length. He slapped the collapsed weapon into the locking holster on his hip. From a pocket on his other leg, he pulled out an Omni tool and crept forward, using it to scan the area for faint signals that would indicate the presence of any unusual electronics. Nice catch, LT, he muttered after checking the results. Proximity mine wired to the door. The Corporal made a few adjustments to the Omni tool, emitting a short energy pulse to jam the sensors on the mine so he creeped forward close enough to disarm it. The entire process took less than a minute. Anderson held his breath the whole time, only releasing it when O'Reilly turned and gave him the thumbs up to indicate that the trap had been rendered harmless. A nod from Anderson sent the rest of the team rushing forward to breach the door, taking up their pre-assigned positions. Anderson and Shay moved to either side of the exterior wall of the building. Chief Da crouched low in line with the door a few meters away. Behind her and slightly off to the side, Lee had his assault rifle raised and pointed at the entrance, providing Da's cover. O'Reilly, crouched down beside Anderson, reached up and punched in the access code on the panel. As the door slid open, Da tossed a flashbang grenade from her belt into the foyer beyond, then dove to the side and rolled for cover. Lee did the same as the grenade detonated with a blinding flash of light and a fog of thin, wispy smoke. An instant after the blast, Anderson and Shay spun in through the door, rifles raised and ready to gun down any enemies inside. It was a classic flash and clear maneuver, executed with flawless precision, but the room beyond the door was empty, save for a few splatters of blood on the floor and walls. All clear, Anderson said, and the rest of the team came in to join him. The entry was a plain room with a single hallway leading off the back wall deeper into the base. There was a small table flipped in the corner and several overturned chairs. A monitor on the wall showed an image of the landing port outside. Guard post, Dawes said, the evidence confirming for her what Anderson had suspected earlier. Probably four of them stationed here to keep an eye on the spaceport. Must have opened the blast doors when the ships landed and went out to help them unload their cargo. I've got blood smears heading down this hallway, Lieutenant, Private Indigo called out. Looks like the bodies were dragged out of this room and back into the facility. Anderson still couldn't figure out why anyone would drag the bodies away like this, but at least it gave them a clear trail. The ground team slowly made their way deeper into the base, following the smears of blood. The trail took them through to the cafeteria, where they saw more overturned tables and chairs, as well as holes in the walls and ceiling. Clear indication that the room had recently been witness to a brief but intense firefight. Further in, they passed two separate dormitory wings. The door to each individual room had been kicked open, and the interiors, like the cafeteria, were riddled with bullet holes. A picture formed in Anderson's mind. The attackers, once inside, systematically going from room to room, massacring everyone in a hail of gunfire, and then dragging the bodies away with them. By the time they reached the back of the building, they had yet to see any sign that enemy troops were still here. They did, however, make a separate discovery that none of them had been expecting. At the very rear of the facility was a single large elevator going straight down into the earth below. No wonder this base looks so small, O'Reilly exclaimed. All the good stuff is buried underground. Damn, I wish we knew what they were working on, he muttered a moment later in a more somber tone. God knows what we're about to walk into. Anderson agreed, but he was concerned with a more immediate detail. According to the panel on the side of the wall, the elevator was down at the bottom level. If someone had gone into the lower floors at the base only to flee when they got word the Hastings was coming, the elevator should have been at the top floor. Something wrong, LT? Da asked. Somebody took that elevator down, he said, tilting his head in the direction of the panel, but they never took it back up. You think they're still down there? The gunnery chief asked, her tone making it clear she hoped they were. The lieutenant nodded, the hint of a grim smile on his lips. So, what happened to their ships? Private Shay asked, still not piecing it all together. Whoever attacked this base came for something, Anderson explained. Whatever they were looking for wasn't up here. They must have sent a team down to the lower levels to finish up the job. Probably only left a few men up here to keep an eye on things. But they weren't counting on an Alliance patrol ship being close enough to respond to the distress call so quickly. When their scout ship sent word someone was coming through the mass relay, they knew they had about 20 minutes to pick up and clear out. I bet they never even bothered to tell their buddies down below. What? Why not? Why wouldn't they tell them? Those elevators might go down 2 full kilometers, Corporal O'Reilly chimed in, helping to spell it out for the inexperienced private. Looks like the comm panel to the lower level was destroying the gunfire. No chance of getting a radio message to anyone down below through that much rock and ore. And it could take 10 minutes for the elevator to make the trip one way. They wanted to alert their friends in the basement. It'd take a half an hour, 10 minutes to call the elevator up from the lower floor, 10 minutes to send someone from the top down to warn them, then 10 more minutes back up again, he continued. By then it'd be too late. Easier to just bug out and leave the others behind. Shay's eyes were wide with disbelief. They just abandoned their friends? That's what separates mercenaries from soldiers, Anderson told him before turning his focus back to the mission. This changes things. We've got an enemy unit down there, and they have no idea an alliance squad is up above waiting for them. We can set up an ambush, Daw said. As soon as those elevator doors open, we start firing and rip those sons of bitches to ribbons. She was speaking quickly, a wicked gleam in her eye. They won't stand a chance. Anderson thought for a second and then shook his head. It's obvious this is a seek and destroy mission. They aren't planning on leaving any survivors. There could still be Alliance personnel alive on the lower levels. If there's any chance we can still save them, we have to try. Could be dangerous, sir, O'Reilly warned. We're assuming they don't know we're here. If they somehow do, then we'll be the ones walking into an ambush. That's a risk we have to take, Anderson said, slamming his fist against the wall panel to call the elevator back to the surface. We're going in after them. The rest of the group, including O'Reilly, responded with a sharp, "Sir, yes, sir." The long, slow elevator descent was even more agonizing than the wait for the ship's hull at the start of the mission. Minute by minute, the tension grew as they sank deeper and deeper beneath the planet's surface. The lieutenant could hear the faint hum of the elevator winch, a dull drone boring into the back of his skull that grew steadily fainter but never entirely disappeared as they dropped even further down the shaft. The air became heavy, warm, and moist. He felt his ears pop, and he noticed a strange smell in the air, an unfamiliar stench he imagined was a mixture of sulfurous gases mingling with alien molds and subterranean fungi. Anderson was sweating profusely beneath his body armor, and he kept having to reach up with a free hand to wipe away the fog condensing on his visor. He did his best not to think about what would happen if the doors opened and the enemy was ready and waiting for them on the other side. When they finally reached the bottom of the shaft, the enemy was waiting for them, but they sure as hell weren't ready. The elevator opened into a large antechamber, a natural cave filled with stalagmites, stalactites, and thick limestone columns. The artificial lights strung across the ceiling illuminated the entire chamber, reflecting off thick veins of glistening metallic ore and the cavern's countless natural rock formations. At the far end was a passage that served as the cave's only other exit, a long tunnel that wound around the corner and out of sight. The enemy forces, close to a dozen armed and armored mercenaries, were coming toward them from the far side of the chamber. They were laughing and joking, weapons at their sides as they headed for the elevator that would bring them back to the planet's surface. It only took Anderson a fraction of a second to decide they looked like murdering raiders and not Alliance personnel, and he gave the order to fire. His team had been poised and ready as the elevator doors opened, and they reacted almost instantaneously to his command, charging forward from the elevator with a barrage of gunfire. The first wave of their attack ripped into the pack of unsuspecting mercs. The fight would have ended right then if it wasn't for their body armor and kinetic shields. 3 of the enemy combatants dropped to the floor, but enough of the deadly projectiles were deflected or absorbed so that the rest of them were able to fall back and dive for cover behind the boulders and stalagmites that littered the cavern's floor. Vader scene from Rogue One. Yeah. The next few seconds of the battle were utter chaos. Anderson's team pushed forward, scrambling to use the cave's rock formations for cover. They had to feint out quickly before enemy crossfire could pin the entire group down in a single location. The cavern echoed with the staccato recoil of assault rifles and the sharp zip 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 of boils ricocheting off the rock formations and walls, and the incandescent tracer bullets that made up every fifth round ignited the room with a ghostly luminescence. Why is my chair so uncomfy? Sprinting to a nearby large stalagmite, Anderson felt an all-too-familiar shudder as his kinetic shields repulsed several shots that would have otherwise found their mark. He hit the ground and rolled as a line of bullets struck the floor just in front of him, disintegrating the stone and sending tiny showers of water and dust up under his visor and onto his face. He came to his feet, spitting out the foul grit, instinctively checking the remaining power on his shields. He was going down to 20%, not nearly enough to give him a fighting chance if he had to make another run through direct enemy fire. Shield status, Anderson shouted into his radio. The numbers came back at him rapid fire. 20, 25, 20, 10. His team was still at full strength, but the shields had taken a beating. They had lost their initial advantage of surprise, and they were now facing an enemy squad nearly double their number. But Alliance soldiers were trained to work as a team, to cover each other and watch one another's back. They trusted their teammates and they trusted their leader. He figured that would give them the edge they needed over any band of mercs. Da, Lee, move up to the right, he barked. Try to flank them. The lieutenant rolled to his right, emerging from behind the stalagmite, shielding him from view and firing a quick covering burst in the direction of the enemy. He wasn't trying to hit anything. Even with the smart targeting technology built into all personal firearms, it was almost impossible to hit a human-sized target without taking at least a half second to steady and aim. But inflicting damage was not his goal. All he wanted to do was disrupt the enemy so that they wouldn't have time to line up Lee or Dahl while they alternately advanced, darting in and out of cover. After a 2-second burst, he rolled back behind his own cover. It wasn't good to stay out in view of one place for too long. Even as he did so, Shay popped out from behind a large boulder to lay down another covering burst for his squad mates on the move, and as he ducked back to safety, O'Reilly filled in. As soon as the corporal pulled back, Anderson poked his head out and fired again. This time, he emerged from the left side of the stalagmite. Jumping out from behind cover in the same position twice in a row was a sure way to catch an enemy round in the teeth. He ducked back in and heard Daw over his radio saying, "In position, laying down covering fire." Now it was his turn to move. "I'm on the go," he shouted just before he scrambled out into the open, crouched low and running hard for another nearby piece of the cave's natural architecture that was large enough to protect him from enemy bullets. Skidding to a stop behind a thick column, he had just enough time to catch his breath and lay down covering fire as he ordered Shay and O'Reilly to make their runs. Again and again they repeated the process, Anderson sending one person to move while the others laid down covering fire to keep the enemy on the defensive. He varied who would go each time. The key was to keep the team moving and keep their opponents off balance. Staying in one place would let their enemies focus on them and bring multiple shooters to bear, or, even worse, start lobbing grenades in their direction. But there had to be a purpose and direction to the movement. They had to follow a plan. For all the mayhem and random confusion of battle, the lieutenant had been trained to approach firefights like a game of chess. It was all about tactics and strategy, protecting and defending your pieces as you maneuvered them one by one to develop a stronger overall position. Working as a single unit, the Alliance squad was pushing its advantage one soldier at a time, slowly maneuvering themselves to where they could flank the enemy, drive them from their cover, and catch them in the crossfire. The mercs could feel it happening too. They were pinned down by the coordinated efforts of Anderson and his crew, trapped, virtually helpless. It was only a matter of time before they launched a suicidal counter-assault or broke ranks in a desperate retreat. In this case, they chose the latter. It seemed to happen all at once. The mercs burst from their cover, backpedaling toward the passage behind them as they fired wild bursts in the vague direction of the Alliance soldiers. Exactly what Anderson and his team had been waiting for. As the mercs fell back, Anderson stood up from behind the boulder as he was using for cover. He was exposing his head and shoulders, but someone running backwards while shooting an assault rifle would be lucky to hit the broadside of a battleship, let alone a target half the size of a human torso. He braced his weapon on top of the boulder to steady it, took careful aim at one of the mercs, let his weapon's auto-targeting systems get a hard lock, then slowly squeezed the trigger. The merc did a short stuttering dance as a steady stream of bullets depleted his shields, shredded his armor, and ripped through his flesh. The whole sequence took maybe 4 seconds from start to finish, an eternity if they had been worried about someone on the other side calmly lining them up in their sights. But with that threat now gone, Anderson had more than enough time to guarantee his aim was lethally accurate. He even had a chance to line up a second merc and take her down too. And he wasn't the only one taking advantage of the situation. All told, his team dropped 7 of the mercs during their desperate retreat. Only 2 managed to escape with their lives, making it to the safety of the passage and disappearing around the corner. Okay, that's the end of that chapter. Let me plug in my mouse real quick, because it is flashing red. Alright. That's all out of the way. Let's continue. Chapter 3. Anderson then immediately sent his crew chasing after the fleeing mercs. As soon as they lost visual contact with their enemy, pursuing them turned into a fool's game. Every corner, turn, or branching hallway they'd come across would represent a chance for a potential ambush. Instead, Daw, O'Reilly, and Lee took up defensive positions guarding the passage in case the mercs came back, possibly with reinforcements. With the only point of insurgents covered, Anderson and Shea were free to examine the bodies. They'd killed 10 mercs in the battle. Now they were picking through their corpses, a ghoulish but necessary denouement to every engagement. Step 1 was to identify any wounded survivors who could suppose potential threat. Anderson was relieved to find all of the downed figures were already dead. It wasn't Alliance policy to execute helpless foes, but taking prisoners would have introduced a whole new set of logistical problems to a mission that was already complicated enough. The next step was to try and identify who they were working for. 5 of the dead were Batarians, 3 were humans, and 2 were Turians, 8 males, 2 females. Their equipment was a hodgepodge of military and commercial arms from a wide variety of manufacturers. Officially recognized military units tend to be made up of a single species and carried only one brand of weapons and armor, the inevitable result of corporations signing exclusive supply contracts with the overseeing governments. These were most likely soldiers of fortune, members of one of the Verge's many freelance mercenary bands that hired themselves out to the highest bidders. Most mercs had tattoos or brands burned into their flesh proclaiming their allegiance to one group or another, usually prominently displayed on the arms, neck, and face, but the only markings Anderson found on the fallen were indistinct splotches of raw, scabby skin. He was disappointed but not surprised. For jobs where secrecy was important, crews often had their markings removed with an exfoliating acid wash, then reapplied after the mission, a simple but painful procedure that was charged back to whoever had hired them. Obviously, the group hired to attack Sedan had feared Alliance retaliation and done their best to remove anything that might expose them if something went wrong. There had still been no counterattack from the enemy by the time Anderson and Shea finished stripping the bodies of grenades, metagel, and anything else useful and small enough to easily carry. "Looks like they're not coming out again," Daw grumbled as Anderson came over to stand beside her. "Then we have to go in after them," Anderson replied, slapping a fresh power pack into his kinetic shield generator. "We can't wait out here forever, and there's still a chance we'll find some of our own people alive down here." "Or more mercs," O'Reilly muttered, replacing his own power pack. The corporal was only saying what they were all thinking. For all they knew, there was another full enemy squad deeper inside the base, and the two men who'd fled the battle had already managed to warn the reinforcements. But even though they might be walking into a trap, they couldn't turn back now. The lieutenant gave the rest of his team a moment to gear up before shouting, "Daw, Shea, take the point, let's move out." They advanced into the rough-hewn passage, maintained a standard Alliance patrol formation, the two Marines on point up front, Anderson and O'Reilly 3 meters behind them in the middle, and Lee 3 meters behind them watching their backs. They all had weapons raised and ready as they made slow but steady progress through the uneven, irregular tunnel that had been bored through the rock. They were officially in a hot zone now, and caution was more important than speed. One moment of careless inattention could cost all of them their lives. 10 meters in, the corridor turned sharply to the left. The team stopped short at a hand signal from Daw, who crept forward and poked her head around the corner, momentarily exposing herself to possible enemy fire before ducking back. When she gave them the all clear, they continued on. Beyond the corner, the passage continued for another 20 meters before reaching a sealed security door. The heavy metal barrier was closed and locked. Anderson signaled to O'Reilly, and the corporal moved forward to work his tech magic and override the lockdown codes. The rest of the team assumed standard positions for another flash and clear procedure. "If those mercs are locking the security doors," Dahl whispered to her commanding officer as they waited for the door to open, "that means they must have codes for the base. Someone on the inside must have been working for them." Anderson didn't reply, but he gave a grim nod. He didn't like the idea that someone inside Sedan had managed to betrayed the Alliance, but it was the only explanation that made sense. The mercs had known the facility was expecting an off-world shipment, and they must have had the proper landing codes to get their ships on the surface without raising any alarms. They'd been familiar enough with the layout to clear out the upper area and make their way to the elevators at the back without letting anyone escape, and they had to have access to the restricted lockdown codes to seal the security door. All the evidence pointed to the inescapable conclusion that there had been a traitor at Sedan. The door slid open and the team sprang into action, using a flash grenade to blind anyone on the other side, then charging in only to find the area beyond empty. They were now standing in a large square room, about 20 meters on each side. The shiny metal walls, ceiling, and reinforced floor made it clear they were now entering the heart of the research facility. Everything had a sleek, modern feel, a sharp contrast of the rough-hewn natural tunnels they had just passed through. There was a hall leading off to the left and another to the right. Got a blood trail over here, O'Reilly called out on the left. Looks fresh. We'll follow it, Anderson decided. Lee and Shay set up position here. He didn't like splitting up the team, but they didn't know the layout at the base. He didn't want any of the mercs doubling around behind them and making it back to the elevator. O'Reilly, fall in. Leaving the two privates to guard the only way out, Anderson and the others set off down the hall on the left, moving ever deeper into the research complex. They passed several more intersections, but Anderson wasn't willing to split his squad up yet again. Instead, the three of them simply followed the blood trail. Along the way, they passed a number of rooms, most of them small offices, judging by the desks and personal workstations. Like the dorm on the upper levels, each had been thoroughly ravaged by gunfire. The killing spree that began on the surface had continued unabated underground, and once again the mercs hadn't been content to leave their victims where they had fallen, but for some inexplicable reason had dragged them off. It was 5 minutes later when they finally came across the source of the blood trail they'd been following. A Turian lay face down on the floor in the middle of a medium-sized room, bleeding profusely from a wound to his leg. Anderson recognized him as one of the mercs who had fled the recent battle. Approaching carefully, he knelt down beside the motionless figure to check for a pulse but found nothing. There was only one other exit from the room, another sealed security door off to one side. You think his buddy's inside there? Da asked, using her assault rifle to point to the closed portal. I doubt it, Anderson replied. He probably knew we'd be following the blood trail. I bet he ditched this guy at one of those other branches farther back. Probably waited for us to go by, then made a mad dash back to the exit. I hope Shay and Lee are on their toes, Da muttered. They can handle him, Anderson assured her. I'm more interested in what's behind this door. Probably leads to the primary research lab, O'Reilly guessed. Maybe we'll finally get some answers in there. They rolled the dead merc out of the way. There was no sense taking the chance of someone tripping over his body if there was another firefight waiting for them beyond the door. Then, on Anderson's command, the corporal set to work overriding the security lockdown, while the lieutenant and Chief Da took position for another flash and clear operation. Da was the first one through this time, and once again, there was nobody on the other side. Nobody alive, anyway. Sweet mother of mercy, she gasped. Anderson stepped into the room and felt his stomach lurch at the gruesome spectacle before him. O'Reilly had been correct. They were standing in an enormous lab dominated by a massive central server. The only way in or out was the door they had just came through, and like the rest of the base, every piece of equipment in the room had been blasted beyond hope of repair. But none of that was what evoked their reactions. At least 30 corpses were strewn about the room, most piled along the walls on either side of the entrance. Their uniforms marked them as Alliance personnel, the guards and researchers killed throughout the other sections of the facility. The mystery of where all the bodies had gone was solved, though Anderson still couldn't figure out why they had all been dragged to this single location. Check for survivors, sir? Da asked, her voice not holding out much hope. Wait, Anderson said, holding up his hand to freeze his team in place. Nobody move a muscle. Oh my god, O'Reilly whispered, just now recognizing what Anderson had already seen. The entire room was wired with explosives. Not simple proximity mines, but countless 10-kilo detonation charges placed strategically around the lab. For Lieutenant Anderson, all the pieces suddenly fell into place. There were enough explosives here to vaporize everything inside the room, including the bodies. That was why they'd been so carefully collected here. There'd be no way to positively ID the remains, meaning whoever betrayed Sidon would be presumed dead with all the others. They could assume a new identity and live off the profits of their crime with no chance of repercussions. A soft electronic beep made Anderson realize that finding the traitor was the least of their problems. Timer, O'Reilly hissed, his voice raw with fear and nervous energy. A second later it beeped again, and the lieutenant knew the dying merc had lured them into a trap. The detonation sequence was counting down, and their fate, survival or death, would very likely be determined by the next order he gave. In the split second between beeps, his mind analyzed and evaluated the situation. The size of the blast from the explosives would be enormous, more than enough to destabilize the entire underground complex. It would probably cause a cave-in, collapsing the huge natural chamber back by the elevator. Even if they were far enough away to survive the blast, they'd be out of air long before rescue workers would ever find them. O'Reilly was a tech expert. There was a chance he could disarm the trigger before it went off, if they had enough time to find it, and if there wasn't a backup, and if it was a manufacturer he's familiar with, and if there weren't any built-in failsafes to prevent manual overrides. Too many ifs. Disarming it wasn't an option, which meant the only thing left for them to do was run. Responding to his order, all three of them wheeled away and sprinted back down the halls the way they came. "Shay, Lee," Anderson shouted over his radio, "get to the elevator, now." "Aye, sir," one of them shouted back. "Wait for us as long as possible, but if I give you the order, you go without us. Is that understood?" There was silence on the other end of the radio. The only sounds were the clomping boots and heavy breathing of the three Alliance soldiers sprinting down the hall. "Private, do you hear me? If I say go, you damn well go, whether we're there or not." He was worded with a reluctant, "Understood, sir." They were racing through the halls as fast as they could run, slipping and skidding around corners in a desperate attempt to beat out the timer that could go off at any moment. There wasn't any time to check for enemy ambushes. They just had to hope they didn't run into one. Rounding the corner into the room where Anderson had earlier ordered Shay and Lee to wait for them, their luck finally ran out. Gunnery Chief Daw was in the lead, her long legs allowing her to eat up extra ground with every stride, and she had pulled a few meters ahead of her two male companions. She ran full speed into the room, and right into a spray of gunfire. The lone surviving merc, a Batarian, was waiting for them. He must have stumbled into the room after Shay and Lee had pulled back to the elevator on Anderson's command. Since then, he'd been waiting patiently, just hoping for a chance to extract some form of petty revenge. The force of the bullets picked Daw off her feet and sent her crashing to the ground in a heap. Her forward momentum caused her body to somersault across the floor until she stopped, crumpled and motionless in the corner. Anderson was the second one into the room. He charged with his weapon already firing. Normally, running straight at a stationary enemy with a loaded assault rifle was pure suicide, but the merc had foolishly kept his attention on Daw as she tumbled and fell. He wasn't even looking in Anderson's direction. By the time he tried to spin around and fire back at his charging foe, the lieutenant was virtually on top of him, so close that even while running he was able to aim accurately enough to blow a hole in the Batarian's chest. O'Reilly arrived a split second later, coming to his stop when he saw Daw lying in a rapidly spreading pool of blood. "Go!" Anderson shouted at him. "Get to the elevator!" O'Reilly gave a curt nod and took off, leaving Anderson to check on their fallen comrade. The lieutenant dropped to one knee and rolled her over, then nearly jumped back in surprise when her eyes flickered open. "Stupid bastard aimed too low," she said through gritted teeth. "Took me in the leg." Anderson glanced down and saw that it was true. A few stray bullets had penetrated the kinetic barriers protecting her torso, only to ricochet off the heavy plates of body armor, inflicting no damage beyond small dents and discolorations. But her right leg, where the armor was thinner and the highest concentration of fire had drained the shields, had been reduced to pulp and hamburger. How do they describe it as hamburger? That's not how I would describe somebody like mangled leg after it got shot. "You ever have a piggyback, Chief?" Anderson asked her, tossing his weapons to the ground and rapidly stripping off his own body armor. "I was never a piggyback kind of girl, sir," she replied, snapping off her belt and discarding every piece of equipment that wasn't strapped on. "Nothing to it," he explained, reaching down to help her into a sitting position. She still had her body armor on, but they'd already wasted too much time. "All you gotta do is hold on." He did his best to help her wrap her arms around his neck and shoulders, then stood up, momentarily staggering under the large woman's weight. He reached back to help support her weight, clutching her thighs and buttocks while her arms locked around his collar in a fiercely strong grip. "Giddy up," she grunted, doing her best to hide the agony the movement was inflicting on her mangled limb. Anderson took a few unsteady steps, struggling to find a way to move as quickly as possible while balancing the awkward load. By the time they emerged from the passage into the large stalactite-filled cavern, he had found an awkward but effective cadence somewhere between a gallop and a trot, and then the timer detonated. From the main laboratory in the heart of the research base, an enormous ball of heat, fire, and force burst loose, laying waste as it swept through the complex. Doors were warped and ripped off hinges, floors buckled, walls melted. Far away in the natural cavern, the effects of the explosion were felt in three distinct stages. First, the ground seemed to heave under Anderson's feet, and sending him tumbling to the ground. Da screamed as her legs slammed against the floor, but her voice was drowned out by the second phase of the explosion, the deafening boom that echoed throughout the cavern and drowned out every other sound. The final phase was a wall of hot air propelled by the blast spilling out from the passage to roll over them, pinning them to the ground, burning their lungs and leaving them gasping for air. Anderson struggled to breathe, and for a second he nearly blacked out. He fought to maintain consciousness as the invisible hand squeezing his chest and pinning him to the ground slowly released its pressure, while the superheated air expelled by the blast dispersed itself throughout the cavern. They weren't out of danger yet. The force of the blast had rocked the cavern. The strings of artificial lights ripped loose, swaying wildly and casting bizarre, crazy shadows throughout the room. And though his ears were still ringing, he could plainly hear the loud, sharp cracks of stress fractures appearing in the walls and ceiling as the cavern began to collapse. "O'Reilly," he shouted into the radio, hoping his 3 men in the elevator could still hear him. "This place is caving in. Get to the surface, now!" "What about you and Da?" The reply was barely audible inside Anderson's helmet, though from the tone it was clear the corporal was shouting. "Send the elevator back down after you get to the top," he snapped. "Now move, that's an order." Not waiting for a reply, Anderson scrambled over to check on Gunnery Chief Da. She had passed out, the pain in her leg too much to bear on top of the physical trauma of the explosion's aftershocks. Summoning what was left of his strength, the lieutenant managed to stand up, slinging her over his shoulders in a fireman's carry. He began a desperate, staggering race to freedom as the chamber disintegrated around him. Stalactites plunged down like enormous, jagged limestone spears, the fragile hold they had maintained on the ceiling for thousands of years finally failing. Huge cracks were spreading through the floor, walls, and roof, causing great chunks of rocks to shear off and tumble to the floor, where they exploded into dust and rubble on impact. Anderson did his best to block it all out. There was nothing he could do but keep moving and pray they weren't crushed from above, so he forced his mind to focus solely on placing one foot in front of the other. He wasn't sure he was going to make it. The swinging strings of light caused a strobe-like effect that made it difficult to keep his balance on the uneven ground. He was bruised and beaten from the concussion of the blast. Exhaustion and fatigue were setting in. The muscles in his thighs and calves were burning. The adrenaline rush he'd felt at the beginning of the mission was gone. His body simply had nothing left to give. He moved slower and slower, the unconscious woman draped over his shoulders, feeling as heavy as the massive slabs of rock raining down around them. When the elevator finally came into view, he wasn't surprised to see O'Reilly, Shay, and Lee still waiting for him. Seeing their commander staggering like the living dead, all three of them rushed out to help. Anderson was too exhausted to object. He simply let Da slide from his shoulders into the grasp of the two privates, one taking her under the shoulders and the other one under her hips. With the burden removed, he lost his balance and nearly fell over, but O'Reilly was there to catch him. Leaning on the corporal for support, he managed to take the last 20 steps into the elevator before collapsing in the corner. The door slammed shut and the car began the long journey up to the top. The ride was far from smooth. The elevator moved in fits and starts as the gears screeched and squealed. Nobody said anything, as if they were afraid mentioning their precarious position might make it worse. Anderson simply lay where he had fallen, panting and wheezing as he tried to catch his breath. By the time they reached the top and spilled out into the safety of the service, he had recovered enough to speak. I told you not to wait for us, he chastised his team as they made their way back to the Hastings, the privates still carrying Dahl's unconscious body between them. I should bust each of you down a full rank for disobeying orders. He paused to let that statement sink in. That, or recommend you all for medals. Okay, sorry about that. I had to drink some water and respond to a message. Chapter 4. First Lieutenant Kali Sanders was smart. She was one of the Alliance's top computer and systems technicians. She was attractive. Other soldiers at the base were always trying to pick her up when she wasn't on duty. She was young. At 26, she could expect at least another half century of healthy, productive years ahead of her, and she knew she was on the verge of making the biggest mistake of her life. She glanced warily around the bar, sipping nervously at her drink as she pressed herself deeper into her small corner, trying not to draw attention. Average in both height and build, Kali's only really distinguishing feature was her shoulder-length blonde hair, a genetically recessive trait. Natural blondes were nearly extinct, but her hair was a dirty blonde, with streaks edging towards shades of brown, and there were still plenty of humans who dyed their hair blonde anyway. She didn't normally stand out in a crowd. That made it easy for her to escape noticed here. The black hole was packed. Most of the crowd was human, not surprising, considering the bar was an upscale establishment within walking distance of spaceports on Elysium, the Alliance's oldest and largest colony in the Skyllian Verge. But at least a third of the patrons were made up of other species. Batarians were the most predominant. She could see their narrow heads bobbing on their sinewy necks among the crowd. They had oversized nostrils and large triangular noses that were almost flat against the face, the tip pointing straight down to their thin lips and pointy chin. Their faces were covered with hair so short and fine it looked like a soft velvet of a horse's nose, though the hair grew longer and thicker around the mouth. A flat stripe of ridged cartilage ran along the tops of their skulls and down the backs of their necks. But the most unique characteristics of the species was undoubtedly the fact that they possessed two distinct sets of eyes. One pair was a wide set and prominent bony sockets protruding from the corners of their face, giving their skulls a noticeable diamond shape. The second set of eyes was smaller and closer together, set higher on the face, just beneath the middle of the forehead. Batarians had a habit of looking at you with all four orbs simultaneously, making it difficult for a binocular species to know which pair to focus on during conversation. The inability to maintain eye contact was disconcerting for most other species, and the Batarians always tried to exploit this advantage in situations involving bargaining and negotiations. Like the Alliance, the Batarian government was actively settling the Verge, trying to establish a foothold in a region ripe for expansion, but the Black Hole currently played host to several other aliens as well. She saw several Turians among the crowd, their features loblily obscured by the hard tattoo carapaces of flesh and bone that covered their heads and faces like fierce pagan masks. She noticed the quick, darting eyes of a small cluster of Solarians across the room. A pair of massive Krogan loomed in the shadows near the door, like prehistoric dinosaurs standing on their hind legs, guarding the entrance. A few rotund Volus waddled about the room, and a single Asari server, ethereal and beautiful, glided effortlessly through the crowd, moving from table to table while balancing a full tray of drinks. Kali had come here alone, but it seemed as if everyone else in the bar had arrived in a group. They were leaning on the bar, or huddled around the high tables, or milling about on the dance floor, or pressed up against the walls. Everyone seemed to be having a good time, laughing and chatting with friends, co-workers, or business associates. Kali was amazed they could even hear one another. The constant din from 50 simultaneous conversations rose up to the ceiling and crashed down over her like a wave. She tried to escape it by squeezing herself even further back into her own little corner. When she'd first arrived, she had thought the presence of the crowd would be comforting. Maybe she could lose herself in the faceless mass of people. But the drinks of the Black Hole were potent as their reputation, and even though she was only halfway through her second glass, her senses were already slightly dulled. Now there was too much noise, too much motion. She couldn't keep a fix on what was happening around her. Nobody here had any reason to be suspicious of the young woman standing alone in the corner, but she found herself constantly scanning the room to see if anybody was watching her. At the moment, nobody was even glancing in her direction. Not that this observation brought any comfort. She was in a tough spot, and a case of alcohol-fueled paranoia wasn't going to make things any easier. Kali set her drink down on a small counter built into the bar's wall and tried to collect her thoughts, taking stock of the situation. "16 hours ago, she had walked off the premises of the Sidon Research Facility without permission. Leaving the base was a minor infraction. Things escalated when she didn't show up for her assigned shift 8 hours later. Dereliction of duty was serious enough to go on her permanent record, and in another 4 hours her absence would officially become UA, unauthorized absence, a crime punishable by court-martial, dishonorable discharge, and even imprisonment." She picked up her half-finished drink and took another long sip, hoping the alcohol might help slow her racing thoughts. Everything had seemed so simple yesterday when she'd left. Kali had proof that her superiors at Sidon were conducting illegal research, and she was determined to report them. She caught a shuttle leaving a base, flashing a pass she'd forged by hacking into the restricted security files, and arrived here on Elysium a few hours later. It was somewhere on that trip that she'd started having second thoughts. With plenty of time to consider the full consequences of her actions, she began to see that things weren't as black and white as she'd first assumed. She had no idea how many people at that base might be implicated in a formal inquiry. What if people she worked with, people she considered her friends, were somehow involved? Did she really want to bring them down? Part of her felt like this was an act of betrayal. But her hesitations went beyond loyalty to her fellow soldiers. She was taking on a huge risk with her own career. She had evidence Sidon was conducting research way outside the scope of its official parameters, evidence obtained by illegally compromising top security clearance files, acting on nothing more than her initial suspicions and a wild hunch. Her hunch had turned out to be true, but technically, her entire investigation had been an act of treason against the Alliance. Okay, ads are about to happen, so I'm going to take a break to get more water and kind of rest my voice a little bit. So BRB, everyone. Okay, I'm back. Not sure how much longer I'm gonna read. Might do like a couple more chapters, but anyways, let us go ahead and continue at the very least. Where was I? Okay. The more she'd thought about it, the more Kali realized that she had no idea what she'd gotten herself into. She couldn't say if her superiors were acting alone, or if they were just following orders from someone higher up in the chain of command. What if she reported them to the very person who'd ordered the illegal research conducted in the first place? Would anything change, or would it just be covered up? Was she possibly throwing away her career and risking some serious jail time for nothing? In truth, if they really wanted to find her, it wouldn't have been that hard. She was on record boarding a shuttle heading to Elysium with her fake pass, but she doubted the Alliance would send anyone after her, not until she was missing for more than 20 hours and it became a criminal offense, so she still had a little time to decide what to do. Not that a few more hours would make much difference. She'd been struggling with this problem ever since she touched down. Kali was too wired to sleep, too afraid to go back to Sedan and face charges, too scared to press on. She kept moving from bar to bar, having a few drinks then walking it off to sober up. She never stayed in one place for long, fearful of drawing unwanted attention. Her path took her from bar to lounge to club, as she hoped to find some sudden inspiration that would miraculously solve her problem. She glanced up at the news vids showing on the screen set into the wall on the far side of the bar, her eye drawn to a familiar image. Although she couldn't hear what the broadcast was saying, she recognized a file photo from the Sedan research facility. Puzzled, Kali furrowed her brow and squinted, trying to read the rapidly moving type skimming across the bottom of the screen. Alliance research base attacked. Her eyes snapped wide in alarm as she slammed her glass down on the counter, spilling what remained of her drink. Ignoring it, she stepped out from her little corner and shoved her way through the crowd, heedlessly pushing and elbowing the other patrons out of her way until she was close enough to hear the newscaster's words. Details are still sketchy, but we have received official confirmation from Alliance sources that the Sedan research facility appears to have been the victim of a terrorist attack. Anxious to hear more, Kali pressed forward, jostling one of the other human patrons and causing him to spill his drink. The man turned toward her, angrily exclaiming, "Hey, watch where you're..." He trailed off when he realized the bomb had been delivered by a comely young woman. Kali didn't even acknowledge him with a glance, keeping her eyes riveted on the screen overhead. The scene is still restricted pending the Alliance investigation, so we aren't able to bring you any live images. The man looked up at the screen, feigning interest in the hopes of forming a connection with her. "Gotta be the Batarians," he said matter-of-factly. The friend he'd been talking to chimed in as well, eager to impress the attractive newcomer to their conversation. "The Alliance has been predicting something like this for months," he said, assuming the tone of an unquestioned authority on the matter. "My cousin's in the military, and he told me..." A withering gaze from Kali told him to shut up. His silence secured, she turned back toward the vid just in time to catch the tail end of the report. "There are no reported survivors. In other news, the human ambassador to Kamala recently held a press conference to announce the signing of a new trade accord. No survivors." The words left Kali numb, stunning her like a heavy blow to the back of her head. She had been at the base yesterday. Yesterday! If she hadn't run off on this foolish mission, she'd be dead right now. The room began to list to one side, and Kali realized she was about to faint. The man she had bumped into caught her as she teetered, holding her up while she struggled against the vertigo. "Hey, what's the matter?" His voice showed real concern. "You okay?" "Huh?" Kali muttered, not even aware that most of her weight was being supported by a complete stranger. The man helped her stand straight, then let go, though he was poised to leap in again if she fell. He placed a hand on her arm to comfort her, or maybe to help her keep balance. "Did you know someone at the base? Did you have friends there?" Yes. I mean, no. Too much booze, too little sleep, and the shock of what happened at Sedan had momentarily disabled her, but she was beginning to feel secure on her feet again. Her agile mind was clicking. The full implications of what had just happened were finally registering. She'd fled a top secret research base mere hours before it was attacked. She wasn't just a survivor, she was now a suspect. The two men were looking at her with a mixture of puzzlement and concern. She smoothly disengaged herself from the hand on her arm and gave them an apologetic smile. I'm sorry. The story caught me off guard. I know people in the Alliance. Anything we can do? The second man asked. She got the sense his offer was sincere, just a nice guy looking out for a fellow human. But right now, all she wanted to do was get away without doing anything else that can make anyone remember her. No, I'm alright. Thank you, though. She took a step back as she spoke. I have to go. I'll be late for work. Sorry about your drink. She turned and disappeared back into the crowd, heading for the door. Glancing over her shoulder, she was relieved to see neither of them made an attempt to follow her. They simply shrugged, dismissing the bizarre encounter, then resumed their previous conversation. It was dark and chilly outside as she stepped out from the bar. The news of Sidon's destruction had sobered her up, but she could still use a walk in the crisp night air to really clear her head. The Black Hole was located on one of Elysium's main thoroughfares. It was still early in the evening, and the sidewalks were full of people. She moved quickly down the busy street, not heading in any particular direction, just feeling the need to be on the move. Her head was still spinning as she fought her way through the heavy pedestrian traffic. Slowly, the paranoia began to creep back into her thoughts until she shied away from every passerby and jumped at every unexpected sound. She felt vulnerable out here with all these strangers needlessly exposed. A deserted side street offered temporary refuge. She darted down the narrow alley, stopping only when she had gone to the end of the block. The noise of people and monorails coming from the main drag was now only a faint murmur. The news about Sidon changed everything. She had to reevaluate her situation. Had her disappearance somehow triggered the attack? It was hard to imagine it was mere coincidence, but she didn't see how the two events could be related. One thing was certain. They'd be looking for her now. She had to cover her tracks. Find some way to book a flight off Elysium that couldn't be traced back to her. She'd need to find a fake ID or bribe someone to let her board a ship illegally. If she stayed here much longer, someone was bound to... Kali screamed as she felt a heavy hand slam down her shoulder. She was spun around to find herself staring into the chest of a terrifyingly large man with a vice-like grip. Looking up, she met his eyes, cold and hard. Kali Sanders? It was more an accusation than a question. Alarmed, she tried to take a step back, squirming and twisting away in an effort to break free. Her captor shook her once, roughly, and she winced in pain as his nails dug into the flesh of her collarbone. Lieutenant Kali Sanders, you're under arrest on suspicion of conspiring to commit treason against the Alliance. In her surprise, it had taken Kali a second to realize what the man was wearing. Now she clearly recognized his uniform. Alliance MP. They'd found her already. He must have spotted her on the main road and followed her into the deserted alley. All of the fight went out of her. Her head slumped forward as she surrendered to her face. I didn't do it, she whispered. It's not what you think. He grunted as if he didn't believe her, but he did drop his hand from her shoulder. She could feel the skin beneath her shirt bruising already. Pulling out a pair of cuffs from his belt, he held them up for her to see. In a curt voice he ordered, "Turn around, Lieutenant. Hands behind your back." She hesitated, then nodded. Resisting would only make things worse. She was innocent. Now she'd have to prove it in front of a military tribunal. Don't try to run, he warned. I'm authorized to use lethal force if necessary. His words drew her attention to the weapon on his hip even as she slowly turned her back to him, complying with his commands. From the corner of her eye, she was just able to make out the Ahial Syndicate manufactured striker pistol holstered on his hip. Her mind screamed out with a warning even as she felt the cuff slap onto her right wrist. The Honkader P7 was the standard issue pistol for all Alliance personnel, not the striker. The realization came a millisecond after she felt the second cuff slap around her left wrist. Acting on instinct and adrenaline, Kali threw her head back violently. She was rewarded with a wet crunch as it smashed into the face of the fake Alliance MP. She spun around as the man dropped to his knees, momentarily stunned by the unexpected attack. His arm dangled limply at his sides, and a river of blood was pouring from his mouth and nose, creating a moist, dark stain on his face. The perfect target as she brought her knee up, inflicting even more damage to the injured area. The blow knocked him backwards, and he slumped down onto his side, gurgling and choking as the blood clogged his throat. His body twitched and he flailed his legs, trying to ward off his attacker. But Kali was remorseless. She didn't know who this imposter was, mercenary or assassin, but she knew if she didn't get away from him, she was dead. Calling on memories of the hand-to-hand combat classes all Alliance personnel received during basic training, she easily avoided his feeble kicks. With her hands still cuffed behind her back, her feet were her only weapon. She danced around the prone figure, moving in so she could deliver the steel toes and heavy heels of her combat boots to the vulnerable areas of his head and chest. Her opponent rolled onto his stomach, trying to protect himself. Kali hesitated for a second, then spotted his hand fumbling at the holster of his gun. She leapt forward and stomped on his fingers, again and again, turning his digits into a mangled mess of broken bones and mangled flesh. She ignored the whimpers and burbling cries as the man tried to beg for mercy through blood and shattered teeth. He was still conscious, so he was still a threat. She kicked him hard in the temple, possibly fracturing his skull. His body spasmed once, then went limp. Another hard kick to his ribs evoked no reaction, assuring her he was really out. She dropped down onto the ground beside the body, moving quickly in case anybody came into the alley to investigate the commotion. The fake MP had cuffed her hands behind her back, but he hadn't done a very good job of it. The metal rings were loose enough on her wrist to allow Kali to slide them several inches up and down her forearms. There was just enough play that she might be able to get free. Squirming and struggling, she managed to contort her body enough to slide her changed wrists down past her hip bones and along the backs of her thighs to her knees. She rolled onto her back and side, twisting so she could pull her feet through. Her wrists were still cuffed, but at least they were now in front of her. Suppressing a gag reflex, she crawled on her hands and knees through the blood of her assailant until she was directly over his motionless body. He was still breathing in shallow, half-choked gasps. Kali let loose the breath she didn't know she'd been holding. She felt no remorse over the savage beating she'd inflicted while fighting to save her own life, but she was glad she wouldn't have this man's death on her conscience. Training and adrenaline had saved her, that and the carelessness of her opponent, but as her adrenaline wound down, she took in the gruesome scene. She felt the first hints of panic. She was a soldier, but she'd never seen combat duty. She never encountered anything like this. "Come on, Sanders." The voice inside her head was that of her former drill instructor, though the words were her own. "You're not out of this mess yet." She gritted her teeth, determined to finish the job. Even so, Kali shuddered as she fumbled around the man's blood-soaked belt until she found the key to unlock her shackles. Releasing the cuffs proved even more difficult than sliding them around her front, as she had to clasp the key between her teeth and try to fit it into the lock. But after several frustrating minutes, she heard the click, and the bonds fell away from her left wrist. With one hand free, it only took another second to unlock the other cuff, and Kali was free. Kali took a quick look around, relieved to see nobody had stumbled into the alley yet. She grabbed the gun from the man's holster, checked that the safety was on, and stuffed it beneath her jacket and into her belt. She stood up, then froze. She didn't know who the unconscious man at her feet was working for, but it was obvious he had been specifically looking for her. That meant others probably were too. They'd have all the ports staked out, just waiting for her to try to get off-world. She was trapped. She couldn't even go back to the main street, not with her clothes covered in blood. There was only one option left. Taking another breath to calm her jangling nerves, Kali left her assailant's body where it lay, moving quickly in the direction away from the busy thoroughfare. She spent the rest of the night skulking through the back alleys of Elysium, careful to avoid detection, slowly making her way toward the house of the only person she could turn to for help, a man she promised her mother she'd never speak to again. Chapter 5. Within a decade of its discovery by Batarian surveyors, Kamala had become one of the most important planets in the Skyllian Verge. Unlike most colony worlds, where initial populations were small and settlers tended to segregate toward a single major city, Kamala boasted two distinct metropolitan regions of over 500,000 people each. Ujan, the capital, and the slightly larger Hatre, location of the world's primary spaceports. The two cities were nearly 500 kilometers apart, built on opposite sides of a wide, inhospitable desert, the source of Kamala's rapid growth, for below the thin layer of orange sand and on the hard, red rock underneath were some of the largest deposits of Element Zero in the Verge. The rich deposits of Ezo, the galaxy's most valuable fuel source, drove Kamala's economy, drawing in colonists eager to seek their fortunes working at the hundreds of mining and refinery operations scattered across the empty desert. The majority of the world's population were Batarians, and only they enjoyed the full privileges of true citizenship under local law. But like any colony world with a prosperous economy, there was always a steady influx of visitors and immigrants from every recognized species across Citadel space. Kamala was easily one of the wealthiest Batarian colony worlds, and Adan Hada was one of the wealthiest Batarians on Kamala. He was quite likely among the 10 richest individuals in the entire Skyllian Verge, and he wasn't afraid to show it. Normally, he wore the latest in cutting-edge fashions, Asari-designed ensembles made from the finest materials imported from Thessia itself. His preference ran to the opulent and extravagant, flowing black robes highlighted with splotches of red to bring out the hues of his skin. But for the meeting tonight, he had donned a simple brown coat covered in a drab gray overcoat. For someone as infamously ostentatious as Adan Hada, his plain garb was an almost impenetrable disguise. Typically, Adan would be enjoying the soothing nightcap at this hour, sipping on the finest of Hanar liqueurs in the den of his mansion in Ujan. But this night was positively atypical. Instead of relaxing in comfort and luxury, he was stuck sitting on a hard chair in a dingy warehouse in the desert outside Hatra, waiting for the Verge's most infamous bounty hunter to arrive. Adan didn't like waiting. He wasn't waiting alone. At least a dozen other men, all members of the Blue Sun mercenary gang, were milling about the warehouse. 6 of them were Batarian, 2 were Turian, and the rest were human. Adan didn't like humans either. Like his own species, they were bipedal. Similar in height, the humans were thicker in the torso, arms, and legs. They had short, stubby necks and square, blockish heads. And like all binocular species, their faces seemed lacking in character and intelligence. Instead of nostril slits, they had an odd jutting protuberance for a nose. Even their mouths were strange, their lips so full and puffy it was a wonder they didn't slur their speech. He actually thought they closely resembled the Asari, another race Adan didn't like. I know this guy's a Batarian, but why are they just describing him as like hella racist? But he wasn't learned to let personal prejudice get in the way of business. There were several other so-called private security organizations for hire in the Skyllian Verge, and most of them charged a lot less than the Blue Suns, but the Suns had developed a reputation for being both discreet and ruthlessly efficient. Adan had used them several times in the past when unconventional business opportunities had presented themselves, so he knew from personal experience that their reputation was well earned. He wasn't about to trust a mission as important as this one to someone else simply because the Suns had recently started taking on humans, even though it had been a human member of the group who screwed up on Elysium. Oh? More. Normally, Adan would never meet directly with the mercenaries he employed. He preferred to work through agents and go-betweens to keep his identity hidden, and also to avoid dealing with those who were socially beneath him. but the man he was hiring tonight had insisted on meeting in person. Idon had no intention of bringing a bounty hunter into his home, or of meeting with him alone, so he donned the nondescript clothes, left his mansion, and traveled hundreds of kilometers by private plane to the outskirts of Ujan's twin city on the other side of the desert. Now he was spending the night in a cold, dusty warehouse filled with soldiers for hire, sitting in a chair that was causing his back to ache and his legs to go numb, and the bounty hunter was over an hour late. But it wasn't as if he could change his mind. He was in too deep. The Blue Suns in the warehouse knew his identity. Now he'd have to keep them around as his personal bodyguards until this job was finished. It was the only way to make sure they didn't reveal his identity to the rest of the Blue Sun crew. What happened at Sedan was going to draw attention, and Idon couldn't take the risk of someone exposing his involvement. He also needed to make sure there were no loose ends that could link him to the attack, which was why he had agreed to this meeting. "He's here." Idon jumped slightly at the voice. One of the Blue Suns, a fellow Batarian, had crept up silently behind him and was now standing close enough to whisper in his ear. "Bring him in," he replied, quickly regaining his composure. The merc nodded and left the room as his employer stood up, grateful to be out of the uncomfortable chair. A moment later, the guest of honor finally appeared. My nose is like really itchy. It's making it hard for me to focus. He was easily the most impressive Krogan Idon had ever seen. At 2.5 meters tall and nearly 200 kilograms, he was large even by the standards of the reptilian species, but not enormous. Like all Krogan, the top of his spine was slightly curved, giving him a hunched-back appearance. The effect was further enhanced by the heavy frill of bone and scaled flesh growing from his upper back, collar, and shoulders into like a thick shell, from which his blunt head protruded. Rough, leathery plates covered the crown of his skull and nape at his neck. His features were flat and brutish, almost prehistoric. He had no visible nose or ears, and his eyes were small and set wide on either side of his head, though they gleamed with a cruel cunning. A Krogan could live for several centuries, his or her complexion growing duller and darker with age. This one's skin was all mottled browns and tans, with almost no remaining trace of the pale yellow and green markings common to younger members of the species. A labyrinth of discolored welts and scars crisscrossed his face and throat, ancient battle wounds forming a disfiguring pattern, as if all his veins were on the verge of bursting through the surface of his skin. He wore light body armor, but he carried no weapons. Those would have been removed at the door, as per Idon's previous orders. Despite being unarmed, he still radiated an aura of menace and destruction. The Krogan walked with an odd lumbering grace, a force of nature rolling across the floor of the warehouse, merciless and unstoppable. 4 Blue Suns escorted him in, 2 marching on either side. They were there to intimidate the bounty hunter and dissuade him from any aggressive response if the negotiations went poorly. But it was clear that they were the ones who felt intimidated. Their tension was obvious in every step. They moved as though they were standing on the edge of a volcano about to erupt. One of them, a young human with a Blue Sun tattoo covering his left eye, kept reaching down to the pistol at his side as if to draw courage from the mere act of touching it. Idon would have found their discomfort amusing if he hadn't been relying on them for protection. The Batarian decided he would do everything in his power to make sure this meeting went smoothly. As the Krogan approached, his lips pulled back in a snarl, exposing his serrated teeth. Or maybe it was a smile. He stopped a few steps away, still flanked on either side by the 4 mercenaries. "My name is Scar," he growled, his voice so deep it sent thrumming vibrations across the floor. Oh, so he's probably a ninja from Final Fantasy, based on the naming convention of every ninja from that series. "I am Idon Haddah," the Batarian replied, giving a slight tilt of his head to the left, a gesture of admiration and respect among his species. Scar tilted his own head in response, but he leaned to the right, a greeting usually directed at inferiors. Adon bristled involuntarily. Either Scar was insulting him, or the Krogan didn't understand the significance of the gesture. He chose to proceed as if it was the latter explanation, though from what he knew of Scar, there was a good chance it was the former. I don't normally agree to meet with the people I hire, he explained, but in your case, I chose to make an exception. Based on your reputation, your skills are worth bending the rules for. Scar dismissed the compliment with a derisive snort. Based on your reputation, I thought you'd be better dressed. You sure you can afford me? There were some shocked murmurs from the other Batarians in the room. Casting aspersions on the monetary worth of a social better was a grave insult among their culture. Again, Adon wondered if Scar had done this on purpose. Fortunately, he was used to dealing with the less cultured species of the galaxy, and he wasn't hiring Scar because of his renowned etiquette. Rest assured, I have sufficient funds to pay you, he replied, his voice calm and even. It is a simple job. This have anything to do with the Sedan base? Adon's inner eyes blinked once, registering his surprise. Negotiation was a subtle dance of deception and misinformation, each party holding secrets from the other in an effort to gain the upper hand, and Adon had just slipped up. His involuntary reaction had revealed a fact he'd meant to keep hidden. If the Krogan was smart enough to pick up on it. Sedan? Why would you think that? He asked, keeping his voice carefully neutral. Scar shrugged his massive shoulders. Just a hunch, and my price just went up. Your involvement only requires you to find and eliminate your target, Adon countered. His voice gave nothing away, but inside he was silently cursing himself for losing the first round of bargaining. Target? Just one? Just one. A female human. The Krogan turned his head from side to side, scanning the dozen or so blue sun mercs scattered about the warehouse. We've got plenty of men here. Why don't you make them do your dirty work? Adon hesitated. He preferred to ask the questions. He didn't like answering them. He was wary of making another mistake in their negotiation, but even his reluctance gave away more than he intended. Scar barked out a laugh. These Harakors screwed it up, didn't they? Every merc in the warehouse tensed up at his words, confirming them as fact. Not that it mattered. Somehow Adon knew Scar would see through any false denials, so he simply nodded, conceding another point to his opponent. What happened? The Krogan wanted to know. I hired the Blue Suns to find her and bring her in for interrogation, Adon admitted. One of them spotted her on Elysium. They found him several hours later crawling around a side street looking for his teeth. That's what happens when you're too cheap to hire a real professional. One insult too many. The man with the tattoo whipped his pistol out and slammed the butt against the side of the Krogan's skull. The force of the blow rocked Scar's head to the side, but it did not knock him off his feet. He wheeled around with a deafening roar, catching his attacker with a vicious backhand that broke the young man's neck. The other three mercs fell on Scar before their comrade's body hit the ground, their combined weight dragging the big alien to the floor. Before the meeting, Adon had given them strict orders not to kill Scar unless absolutely necessary. He needed him to track down the missing woman. So instead of shooting the bounty hunter, all three were piled on top of him, pinning him to the ground as they tried to pistol whip him into unconsciousness. Unfortunately, nobody had told Scar he couldn't kill them. A long, jagged blade appeared in his hand, materializing from some secret hiding place in a boot, belt, or glove. Adon jumped back from the fray as the blade gashed open the throat of one merc. The return arc sliced through the vulnerable joint between the knee and thigh and the body armor of a second, severing his femoral artery. As he instinctively clutched at the gushing wound with both hands, Scar drove the blade into his chest, piercing his protective vest and puncturing his heart. The blade momentarily stuck in the ribcage as the Krogan tried to pull it out, giving the last surviving merc, another human, the chance to roll away from the pile and scramble to his feet, safely out of the knife's range. The human whipped out his pistol and pointed it at the gore-covered bounty hunter, who was still on the floor. "Don't move," the man screamed, his voice cracking with fear. Scar's head snapped from side to side, ignoring the enemy in front of him as he took stock of the 8 other mercs in the warehouse. Every single one of them had their assault rifles trained on him, ready to fire. The knife dropped to the floor, and Scar raised his empty hands above his head as he slowly stood up. He turned to face Adon as the merc with the pistol took a few steps farther back just to be safe. So what happens now, Batarian? Adon finally had the upper hand in the negotiations, and he was eager to press his advantage. Maybe I should just order them to kill you where you stand. He kept his inner eyes focused on Scar, but let the other pair glance around the room to draw attention to the fact that the bounty hunter was surrounded. The Krogan merely laughed at the empty threat. If you wanted me dead, they'd have shot me before I had a chance to pull my knife. But they didn't. You must have given them orders not to take me out, so I figure I'm worth more to you than a handful of dead mercs. My price just went up again. Even with the warehouse full of armed mercenaries pointing their weapons at him, the Krogan was perceptive enough to turn the situation to his profit. Underestimating Scar's intelligence was a mistake Adon vowed he wouldn't make again. He wondered how many other people had underestimated Scar in the past, and what it had cost them. You could have made a lot more money in my line of work, Scar. He had made no attempt to hide his grudging respect. I make a lot of money in this line of work, and I get to kill people as one of my perks. So let's stop screwing around and make a deal. Adon gave a slight nod and blinked all 4 of his eyes at once, signaling the mercs to lower their weapons. They weren't happy that Scar had killed 3 of their comrades, but loyalty meant less to them than money, and with the 3 dead, their cut just got larger. Only the young human closest to the Krogan, the one with the pistol, didn't comply. He looked around in disbelief at the others, his weapon still aimed directly at Scar. "What are you doing?" he shouted to the others. "We can't just let him get away with this." "Don't be stupid, boy," Scar spat out. "Killing me won't bring your dead friends back. It's just bad business." "You shut up," he snapped back, focusing all his attention on Scar. The Krogan's voice dropped to a menacing whisper. "Think hard about your next move, human. Nobody else is going to step in. It's just you and me." The merc was trembling now, but he managed to keep the pistol aimed at his target. Scar didn't seem concerned. "You've got to the count of 3 to drop that gun." "Or what?" the merc screamed. "You make 1 move and you're dead." 1. Adon noticed the Krogan was suddenly surrounded by a faint aura, barely visible even with the benefit of 2 pairs of eyes. There was a subtle waver around the bounty hunter, as if the light in the room were being ever so slightly distorted as it passed through the surrounding air. Scar was a biotic. The Krogan was one of those rare individuals capable of manipulating dark energy, the imperceptible quantum force that pervaded all the so-called empty space in the universe. Normally too weak to have any noticeable effects on the physical world, dark energy could be concentrated into extremely dense field by biotics through mental conditioning. With their natural talents augmented by thousands of microscopic amplifiers surgically planted through their nervous systems, biotic individuals could use biofeedback to release the accumulated power in a single directed burst, which was exactly what Scar was doing, stalling for time as he gathered enough power to unleash it against the young man still foolishly holding a gun on him. But the merc didn't realize what was happening. Humanity didn't have any individuals with latent biotic abilities. Adon suspected he wasn't even aware such a power existed, but he was about to find out. 2. The merc opened his mouth to say something else, but he never got the chance. Scar thrust a clenched fist in his direction, and the air rippled as a wave of invisible dark energy surged out and over his adversary. The unsuspecting human was picked up off his feet and thrown backwards several meters. He landed heavily on the floor, knocking the wind out of his lungs and sending the pistol flying from his hand. He was stunned only for a second, plenty of time for Scar to cross the distance between them and wrap his 3-fingered hand around the merc's throat. He raised the human to the ceiling, easily holding him with 1 arm as he slowly crushed his windpipe. The merc kicked his dangly heels and clawed at the scaly forearm, choking the life from him to no avail. Your death comes at the hands of a true Krogan battlemaster, Scar casually informed him as his victim's face turned bright red, then blue. I hope you appreciate the honor. The rest of the Blue Suns stood by and did nothing, watching the whole affair with cold disdain. From their expressions, Adon could tell they weren't enjoying the spectacle, but none of them was willing to step in and put a stop to it. None of it meant offending their employer, or incurring the Krogan's wrath. The Merc's struggles grew weaker, and then his eyes rolled back up into his skull and he went still. Scar shook him once, then gave a final squeeze, completely collapsing his trachea before dropping him disdainfully to the floor. I thought you said he had to the count of 3, Adon remarked. I lied. An impressive display, Adon admitted, nodding his head in the direction of the bodies. I only hope you have similar results with Kali Sanders. Of course, you'll have to find her first. I'll find her, the Krogan replied with absolute conviction. That's what I do. John Grisham woke to the sound of someone pounding on his door in the middle of the night. Rumbling, he rolled out of bed and threw on a tattered housecoat, though he didn't bother tying it closed. Any visitor rude enough to get him out of bed at this hour could damn well suffer seeing him in his boxers. He'd actually been expecting something like this ever since he heard Sidon had been attacked. Either someone from Alliance Brass showing up to try and convince him to make some kind of public appearance or official statement, or some reporter looking to get the reaction of one of humanity's most recognizable icons. Whichever it was, they were out of luck. He was retired now. He was done being a hero. He was sick of being some kind of symbol for all of humanity. Now he was just a cranky old man living off his officer's pension. He flicked on a light in the hall and winced at the brightness, still trying to shake off the last vestiges of his groggy sleep. He plodded his way slowly from the bedroom, tucked away in the back of his small, single-story dwelling, toward the front door. The pounding continued, growing more insistent and frantic. God damn it, I'm coming, he shouted, but he didn't bother to pick up his pace. At least the noise wouldn't wake the neighbors. There weren't any. Not close enough to hear, anyway. As far as he was concerned, that was the main selling feature of the house. Elysium had seemed like a good place to retire. The colony is far enough away from Earth and other major settlements to dissuade people from making the trip out of simple curiosity. And with a population of several million, Elysium wasn't large enough for him to just disappear among the masses. Or was large enough for him to just disappear among the masses. Not to mention it was safe, stable, and secure. He could have found somewhere even more remote, but on a less established colony, he'd run the risk of being looked at as some type of savior or de facto leader whenever something went wrong. It wasn't perfect, though. When he first arrived on Elysium 5 years ago, local politicians had pestered him constantly, either wanting him to run on their party's behalf or looking for an endorsement of their own candidacy. Grisham chose to remain completely fair and unbiased. He told every single one of them to go to hell. After the first year, people stopped bothering him. Every 6 months or so, he'd still get a short video message from the Alliance, encouraging him to come back and help serve humanity. He was only in his 50s, too young to sit around and do nothing, they'd say. He never bothered to reply. Grisham figured he'd already done plenty to serve humanity. His military career had always come first. It had cost him his family. But that was just the beginning. There was the 5-year media circus that had followed his pioneering journey through the Chiron Relay, thousands upon thousands of interviews. Things only got worse after his efforts during the First Contact War. More interviews, public appearances, private conferences with admirals, generals, and politicians, official diplomatic ceremonies to meet with representatives of every freaky mutant species of alien the Alliance ran into. Now he was done. Let someone else take the banner and run with it. He just wanted to be left the hell alone. And then some jackasses had to go and attack an Alliance base right on Elysium's doorstep, galactically speaking. It was inevitable someone would figure this was a good enough excuse to resume bothering him again, but they have to do it in the middle of the goddamned night. He was at the door, and the pounding hadn't let up at all. if anything, it had gotten more urgent and intense the longer it took. As he unlocked the door, Grisham decided he would tell the visitor to piss off if they were from the Alliance. If it was a reporter, he'd punch him or her right in the mouth. A terrified young woman stood at the door, shaking in the cold darkness. She was covered in so much blood it took him a second to recognize her. "Ollie? I'm in trouble," she said in a quavering voice. "I need your help, Dad." And that's honestly where we're going to leave off for this today, because, man, my voice hates me right now. And also it is hot as fuck in here, so I do kind of want to end. But yeah, that was a few more chapters of Mass Effect Revelation. I need to actually wake up early one of these Sundays so that I can get, like, a lot of reading in, and not just, like, what was this, 4 chapters? I mean, I guess that's double from what we did last time. Anyways, thank you all for showing up. Tomorrow, it's Military Monday, and I don't know if I made a tweet about this or what, but, yeah, since Military Monday, we're going to be playing GoldenEye 007, so look forward to that, everyone. Anyways, thank you all for showing up, and I'll